So, thank you very much. Welcome back. For all of us who have been following with bated breath the new approaches being taken by the Obama administration to climate change, to energy, to environment, and a whole wealth of other issues, it is, of course, particularly exciting to hear from our next speaker. LaHood is a former congressman in the United States House of Representatives. He says that his avowed priorities in his new post include sustainability and jobs, which, not coincidentally, are the topic of our next panel discussion as well. So I'd like to ask you to please give a very warm welcome to the United States Secretary of Transportation, LaHood. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good noontime. On behalf of President Obama, I am delighted to join you in the beautiful historic city of Leipzig at this year's International Transport Forum. I want to thank our hosts, the Turkish minister, for arranging this and all of the work that you did to make this so successful, and to the mayor, Mary Young. Please help me thank Mr. Minister for all of the work that you did to make this such a success. Would you help me thank the minister? And to the German minister who was good enough to host us at dinner last evening. We had a very, very engaging conversation, not agreeing on everything, but on the majority of things. So thank you for your hospitality and you're welcome, and also to Mr. Short for all of your work over a long period of time to make this such an important international conference. This is one of the most well-attended, I'm told, although it's my first meeting, and I think it's because it's an opportunity for people to come together and meet one another and talk with one another and share ideas. As you know, we're facing a number of serious challenges around the world. For instance, the global credit crunch makes it difficult for all of us to sustain our investments in the transport infrastructure that we depend on to move people and goods around the world. Piracy on the high seas threatens to disrupt our access to international shipping channels. And our nations face an urgent need to reduce our dependence on oil and find sustainable alternative energy sources that will contribute to a cleaner environment. Working together as sovereign nations, we can go a long way towards solving these problems. I believe the way forward is through cooperative agreements on research and technology, mutually enforced standards to enhance security and environmental practices in the global supply chain, effective guidance and training to help the maritime industry combat piracy, and a continuing commitment to opening our borders to free trade. This is very important. This is only the beginning. Achieving these goals will not be easy, and we will not agree on everything. But we are interdependent, now more than ever. Our economic ups and downs ripple across the continents. Our decisions on energy policy and fuel efficiency affect market prices for oil and the rate of climate change. As President Obama said recently, the history of a nation, quote, is not about things coming easy. It's about rising to the moment when the moment is hard, converting crisis into opportunity, and seeing to it that we emerge from whatever trials we face stronger than we were before. End of quote. I believe all of us here today share this commitment, and this forum is an excellent place to carry on this work. In the United States, we are responding to our challenges with short and long-term strategies to ensure that our transport systems continue to play a vital role in our economic development at home and our participation in international trade abroad. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, which President Obama signed into law 3 months ago, is a groundbreaking $787 billion effort to stimulate the U.S. economy through targeted short-term investments in infrastructure, energy, tax relief, and other vital areas. The Recovery Act awarded $48 billion to the U.S. Department of Transportation for new investments in roads, bridges, transit systems, seaports, airports, and other critical infrastructure. To provide some perspectives, this is like managing almost 2 years' worth of federal transportation programs all at once. This is a remarkable, historic effort, and we're managing it with great efficiency. The Department of Transportation has made more money available to states more quickly than any of our routine programs normally do. In some cases, we're moving funds at nearly twice the rate we would otherwise. How have we accomplished this? First, we prepared ahead of time. Even before the recovery legislation was passed, I met with state transportation leaders and told them to prioritize a list of projects that were ready to go for bids. Many states had a backlog of projects which were simply waiting for additional funding. We told them, be ready to move quickly. Fortunately, we have had very good relationships with the states and other stakeholders for many, many years. This helped us achieve the level of cooperation we needed. Second, at the outset, I created a new team of senior officials within our department with expertise in budgeting, planning, operations, and other key areas representing all the modes of transportation. I asked this team to develop reporting standards to accurately track the money as it is spent and ensure that all accountability requirements are met. This is very important to the President. Transparency and accountability. We developed a website. I encourage you to go to that website, recovery.gov. If you do, you will see how our money is being spent, state by state, no earmarks, no boondoggles, no sweetheart deals in America on this plan, all done by the book and all very transparent. And third, we have an extremely capable, dedicated workforce that has worked very, very hard to reach out to our customers around the country and make this program a success. The professional people at the Department of Transportation have done the hard work to help us get this money out the door. And as a result of our efforts, the Recovery Act has so far succeeded in pumping nearly $13 billion in transportation funding directly into our economy, with billions more to follow. These federal funds allow all 50 states to make much-needed repairs and upgrades to roads, bridges, transit systems, port facilities, airport runways, and more. A portion of the funds support cleaner, greener transit vehicles that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These are investments that most states simply cannot afford to make on their own due to very short budgets. So, the federal government in the US of A is truly stimulating local economies and saving or creating thousands of good-paying jobs for Americans. And many of these jobs are green jobs. For example, a company that makes buses that run on alternative fuels is hiring workers thanks to new orders from public transit operators receiving stimulus money. The Recovery Act also breaks new ground for America in the area of high-speed and passenger rail. President Obama personally has committed more than $8 billion to new and revitalized passenger rail corridors across America. This is by far the largest single federal investment in passenger rail in the history of America. It's 8 billion times more money than we've ever had at the Department of Transportation for high-speed rail. This is a down payment on a new effort by the United States to make passenger rail a vital link in our public transportation network. It will bring cities closer together, relieve congestion on our highways, and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. After riding the TGV earlier this week from Paris to Strasbourg, I am more convinced than ever that the USA must look to passenger rail as a way to foster more convenient and efficient intermodal connections. I was very impressed by the intermodal links on the Strasbourg end of the TGV. It's an excellent model for the United States to consider as we pursue our own long-term strategies and investments in public transportation. I would like to mention also that we have a creative way in the $48 billion. It's called discretionary money. $1.5 billion will be available from the Department of Transportation for projects of a national significance, creative intermodal opportunities that I, as the Secretary, and our department will make available around America, again, to create opportunities that will set a national standard for national models of intermodality. $1.5 billion discretionary. Fortunately, it appears that many Americans are ready to leave their cars at home and take more public transportation, including passenger rail. Looking ahead, we recognize that the U.S. must do even more to develop a diverse, environmentally sustainable, multimodal transportation network to keep our economy moving and make our communities more livable. This is a very high priority for President Obama's administration. Livable communities, we call it. Enabling people, if they want to bike to work, walk to work, take a bus to work, take a light rail to work, they don't always have to take their automobile. And we know that in Europe, you all have made that happen. We'd like to replicate that in America. There's a place in America, Portland, Oregon, where they're using streetcars now for people to get around their community. These streetcars are manufactured in Portland. This is the concept, this is the idea of livable communities that we think will fit in some large cities, but also in other cities across America. The President recently announced plans to substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions and raise fuel economy standards for passenger cars and light-duty trucks beginning in model year 2012. And the President also announced an agreement between our department and the Department of EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. We have reached an agreement that a new standard will be set by 2016 so that every automobile in America will get 35 miles per gallon. This is an extraordinary agreement between our department and the Department of EPA. It's a serious push to make transportation much cleaner and greener in the United States. In the freight rail industry, we're in the process of developing new national freight transportation corridors that will help us make better use of trucks, barges, and rails across North America. This integrated approach will reduce congestion on our crowded freight rail lines, take more trucks off the highway, and make better use of underused coastal waterways that have a low environmental impact. We're also expediting critical port development projects to help freight flow more easily, and we're investing $100 million to enhance small shipyards under the Recovery Act. As we do our part, I'm encouraged by the cooperative, multilateral efforts underway by both industry and government to address our shared environmental concerns, especially in Baltic water management and air emissions. I hope we continue to make progress in these areas. Another area we must tackle together is the worldwide shortage of skilled seafarers. We must find ways to grow this profession to keep our maritime industry strong. In aviation, our top priority, our #1 priority at FAA is the Next-Gen program, which will modernize and transform our air traffic control system for the 21st century. Long overdue. I'm prepared to expedite this effort as much as possible. Next-Gen is needed to make aviation safer, more efficient, and more environmentally sustainable. Ambitious energy goals to reduce emissions and noise pollution are a major part of this effort. But as we know, our environmental issues do not stop at our borders. That is why it's good to see that the European community has made progress on CSER, the counterpart to Next-Gen. We still have work to do to harmonize these systems and their goals. I must emphasize that the best way to find workable solutions is by working together, and obviously that is what this meeting is about. We are working with ICAO to develop international consensus, and we look forward to continuing this effort with all of our partners. I also know we have some complex issues to resolve in aviation, such as the inspection of foreign repair stations and foreign ownership of airlines. We're open to a healthy debate on these issues. We'll listen to all sides and work with Congress to achieve a fair solution. In the end, we must all work together, not only to secure a brighter future for our children and grandchildren, but to help developing nations make the right choices as well. Fast-growing nations such as China and India are major sources of emissions, and while both countries have made enormous investments in public transportation, their cities, like many of ours, are still choking on auto and truck traffic. The United States, Europe, Asia must set an example by fighting climate change effectively and setting the pace for leadership and innovation in all modes of transportation. In closing, I am encouraged by the many excellent presentations we've heard today already and we will hear. I look forward to learning more about our common interests and challenges. Leipzig is home to one of the oldest and most important trade fairs in Europe, dating back to the Middle Ages. For centuries, men and women have traveled here by foot, by cart, by bicycle, and by car and truck to buy and sell all types of merchandise. Such activity not only keeps local economies healthy, it also keeps villages, cities, and entire countries connected. I want you to know that you will have a full partner with the United States in these issues as we move forward. And even though we're facing tough times, if we work together and talk together, we will solve these problems together. We're Americans, but we're also a part of the world community. And as the world community, we will solve these big issues on behalf of the people that expect us to do this. So I look forward to working with all of you. Even though this is my first visit, it won't be my last. and you will have a full partner as we move forward to solve these important problems. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you and to have a chance to make this address to all of you. Thank you.
Back for one brief question. I'm bringing Secretary LaHood back because I do have one brief question. Many people here in Europe are thinking that Obama's America is going to look a whole lot more like Europe. And you mentioned a few things that sound like you're on the way: high-speed rail, fuel economy standards, biking. Those are all big steps. But if the U.S. were really to start looking like Europe, it would want to have a nice, meaty fuel tax. Do you think it's something that could ever happen in the U.S.? Maybe not in a downturn, but is it on the horizon ever?
Well, I mean, we do have a fuel tax, and we have the gas tax that people pay, which is over a long period of time in our country help us build a state-of-the-art interstate system in America. We're the model for the interstate. People come to America to look at our interstate system. 2 decades from now, hopefully, we'll be the model for high-speed rail. But in a very, very hard economic time in America, look, there are many people out of work. We are suffering a very hard time in America. But people have confidence in President Obama. They have confidence in his leadership. They have confidence that he is leading us in a way that will get us out of this very hard time. We have many of our friends and neighbors who are out of work. The last thing that you can say to your friends and neighbors when they're out of work and suffering under very hard economic times is that you're going to raise taxes. And so President Obama is not going to raise taxes. He's not going to raise gasoline taxes. We're going to try and think creatively about tolling, about public-private partnerships, help us do the things we want to do, but not by taxing our people in very hard economic times. Only one question?
That's it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, now for the European perspective, we're very pleased to have with us today the EU's Commissioner for Transport and the Vice President of the European Commission as a whole, Anthony Tajani. Prior to taking the reins at DG Energy and Transport, he endeavored to shape European governance as a member of the European Parliament and as a member of the convention that drew up the not yet ratified Constitution. Welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman of International Transport Forum, their Transport Minister, their Wolfgang, thanks a lot for your hospitality in this beautiful time, in this beautiful building. We are very, very happy for this meeting. Many, many thanks. Now I will speak in French and the answer to Mr. LaHood in English after. Moi, je pense que personne ne peut ignorer les liens directs entre la crise économique et les transports.
No one can deny the direct connection that exists between the financial crisis and traffic and transport. All operators are dealing with the same issues. Sometimes, of course, it mainly hits freight transport, prices that go up and increased rates that are on the horizon, but no sector is really not impacted due to the crisis. Now, we see that growth, of course, means that you can very quickly, efficiently move goods from A to B. And ever since the beginning of the crisis, I've been saying that investment has to happen in the area of transport, and structures are such that we need to be able to respond to the crisis. For us, it means almost 10% of jobs, really. But of course, this is, again, not enough. You have to also anticipate what the capacity is. You have to look at competitiveness of Europe. We have to be more competitive, and we believe and assume that the sector of transport is already and will be even more so a key sector. And so therefore the European member countries want to make those right choices. Transport infrastructure will be improved. Many member countries have made the transport sector into the key sector. Now, looking around, I was very, very surprised to see that Mr. Attali is not here anymore. But listening to him, I am more of an optimist, maybe, that he is. We don't always agree, but last night we watched the soccer game between Barcelona and Manchester United, and I think you win if you're willing to attack, if you're willing to try to win the game, win the match, and if you want to try to make full results. Otherwise, at the very last minute, you might lose. And so therefore, I think you need to be focused, and we need to make those investments. And even for those infrastructure projects that are already in the pipeline or even now in construction. And remember, then also we need infrastructure for the future, but immediately we have to start work. Of course, you also have to look at the debt situation, and I agree with Mr. Attali in many instances, and I don't believe that taxes should be raised. No, not at all. Citizens need to regain confidence, and we need to invest in infrastructure. That is a thing that is for certain. So that's the challenge. And it's not easy to overcome it. You need to commit. You need to struggle. You need to take on the responsibility. The commissioners, the ministers on the European level need to stand and say, citizens, we are with you. We are not way up somewhere in these palaces and castles. No, we are standing next to you. We're here to solve the problems. And in this very difficult situation, we want to be steadfast and overcome this. Of course, yes, it is a global crisis. So we shouldn't act in a protectionist manner. We shouldn't create a fortress around us. The European transport system needs to move with the same amount of quality and standards from all countries making up the EU. And in this crisis, of course, I agree with the other ministers that there's also an opportunity. I think you're aware that in China there is a proverb or a word, basically, that is one icon that means chance and crisis, opportunity and crisis, the same pictogram. And so coordinated strategy on the operational, financial level and on the political level needs to be coordinated so that we can face those challenges and own them. Coordinated strategy, however, can't simply stop at the borders of the European Union. We should look beyond that. We should cover also the Mediterranean countries beyond the EU and also the countries on our eastern border of the EU. And I'm very, very pleased to see that also the Russian Minister of Transport is here. I think we need to carry on that dialogue with Russia, the Russian Federation. And of course, we have to realize what the problems are, but we do have the political will and to try to solve those problems. We're dealing with a global crisis. It's not only a European crisis. And we are aware that the outer boundaries of Europe are simply not a boundary, but it's something that needs to be overcome.
I support your position about aviation. Today we will have a meeting with you about aviation. I will work with you for a good agreement about open sky, about this transport system is very, very important, not only for Europe, not only for USA, for all the world. Many, many thanks for your position. I underline your good position. I will work, I think, very well with you. Mais je veux même souligner l'importance du rôle que
But I should like to underscore how important Europe, how important Russia is, and what role it has to play and can play on the African continent. We can talk about economic development, we can talk about growth, we can talk about transport if we simply leave out Africa. And so for this reason, in the middle of the next month of June, with my colleagues at the Commission, I will be submitting a paper, a document, which shows that we have to make that connection between the European and trans-European network and the trans-African networks. We need to strengthen that, because without Africa, we are not going to be able to solve our problems. Political stability of Africa is paramount for Europeans. Without political stability in Africa, without economic development in Africa, and of course, this means further development of infrastructure on that continent. Without that, our major problems of immigration, for example, cannot be solved. And so therefore, we have to commit, we have to help to build the infrastructure system, and we can then also solve problems that Africa has. Also, as far as security and safety is concerned, security of goods and freight traffic and passenger traffic, very important. Look at Somalia. What is happening along the coast, ocean? Of course, we have ships from the United States, from Europe, from Russia. Everybody tries to protect their own passengers on those ships in those waters, but that is not enough. It simply is not enough. You also have to ask the political question and find solutions for Somalia. If extremists are going to win, then it will become increasingly difficult, not only for freight traffic, but all kinds of traffic in all of those countries. And so therefore I am stressing that we need a political commitment on the part of Russia, the United States, and Europe in Africa. And so that is why I wanted to mention this here today while you're here. And in this connection, let me also say that it's important to start up again a new Africa policy. $48 million are expended for infrastructure, and it's very spectacular, a lot more than we're doing here in our European Union. But let's evaluate also what is happening in Europe, what we have been able to mobilize in our European budget, common budget, and also look at what is available on the member state level. So we have stability pacts in the different member countries in order to confront the immediate crisis. We are trying to be a catalyst for investments. We want to help the financial markets. We want to help the enterprises, the companies. And the European Investment Bank needs liquidity, needs capital, and investments are then to be made in order to curb climate change. Also, energy savings need to be promoted, and we want the private sector to get involved. I could quote here under number 3 here we have the public-private partnerships. We talked about all different kinds of models, and the private sector is getting active, and I'm glad that the minister, as well as our President Barroso, mentioned that private sector very important to come on board here. And when you want to set up good infrastructure product, then the private sector has to get involved. But it's the politicians who have to set the framework. We have to be able to give some guarantees, and we also have to appeal to the private sector to come on board. Okay, so we are beset with a financial and economic crisis which is affecting business, and that is why we also need to appeal to the business community. 500 million euros for 2009 is what has been set aside for projects which will be implemented in the very short future, up to 4 or 5 billion euros is what the total will be. And then for the upcoming year and budget, we have a total sum of 2 billion euros that have been set aside for that purpose. So I would wish that we could have more funds available than in the individual member countries, so that we have additional funds available for infrastructure in Europe. So we're trying to take a broad approach here. But I said at the beginning, I'm not totally in sync with what Mr. Attali said in the beginning. There are certain ideas that I go conform with, but he said that one should not only invest, also in not only in old infrastructure, but also develop new ideas for new infrastructure. A couple of years ago, we talked about the trans-European networks, and therefore the Commission and also the Council of Ministers under the presidency of the French government, and it was a meeting in mid-September in Naples. At the time we met, we talked about the trans-European network, and we debated how this network could be expanded, strengthened, and how the market would become stronger, but that we should also open the gates for other countries, east and south of Europe, and maybe even also pick up again and make stronger the connections to the United States of America. So it's a good idea to project this into the future. So therefore, we also invited ministers from the Mediterranean countries. We wanted to really think about the long haul. And I am convinced that transport networks are an excellent vehicle for economic development. I'm from Rome. That's where I come from, and we knew that the development of the Roman Empire had to do with infrastructure. Also, the United States began its steep incline with railroads, and infrastructure is what was important. So let's not forget that. Never forget the lessons that history has taught us. And so, therefore, I can say that Europe and its neighbors and its friends is going to sit down and think about what is good for the future, what is good for transport. We will build a good transport system in order to take up this challenge that besets us at the moment, and I think the financial economic crisis is that challenge. We hope it will not turn into a social crisis, and so therefore we need to struggle together with Africans, Russians, with Americans, women, men from Asia and Africa. It's a global challenge. It's a global solution that we need. And if we work together against protectionism, then it will reach all the way down to Australia. And I think every citizen will thank us for that endeavor, that we have been willing to take up the responsibility and challenge. Thank you very much.
Commissioner, thank you very, very much. Some very important impulses there for our next discussion, which does indeed focus on social as well as environmental aspects of the downturn and its effect on the transport sector. In our first session this morning, we touched several times on the painful choices that face policymakers as they try to balance short-term crisis management and long-term sustainability aims. As you know, the transport sector is hemorrhaging jobs. Just one statistic here. We've seen data showing that in the road sector alone in Europe, 140,000 jobs have been lost. So no wonder politicians are making jobs a priority. Can we preserve employment and simultaneously make transport cleaner and greener? When are environmental, equity, and efficiency considerations mutually reinforcing, and what do we do when they diverge? Those are some of the things that we want to talk about now in our second discussion. And may I ask now, please, to come to the stage as I call out their names. Peter Bakker, who is the CEO of TNT. George Dragnich, who is the Executive Director of the International Labour Organization, ILO. Christian Felber is with the NGO Attac. Stelios Haji-Ioannou is the founder of EasyJet and the president of Easy Group. George Hoon is the Secretary of State for Transport for the United Kingdom. Moritz Leuenberger is his colleague, Federal Councillor, Head of the Federal Department of Transport, Communications and Energy for Switzerland. Graham Smith is the Senior Vice President of Toyota Motors Europe. And finally, I'd like to ask our Rapporteur, Anthony Venables, to please also join us on the podium. See there? There he is. Graham Smith, several of the speakers mentioned the urgent need for innovation, and many of us are relying on innovation to help us get out of the bind of trying to manage crisis management and sustainability aims at the same time. But I've seen studies indicating that in your industry, in the auto industry, car makers that if they were to switch production to smaller vehicles, more efficient vehicles, possibly hybrid, electric, indeed would not be working as labor intensively, that many jobs would go away. Is that right?
I think there are two very distinct responses needed to that. There is the environmental aspect and there is the social and labor aspect. Let me try briefly to cover both. First of all, as a consequence of commercial imperative, as regulation, as environmental challenges have built up towards our industry, the steps that have been necessary to drive down the carbon intensity of our vehicles, of our production processes, obviously have moved forward. Different companies approach it in different ways, and forgive me for speaking on behalf of my own company, Toyota Motor Europe. There are the steps in relation to existing technology, downsizing, that is happening, lighter weight, that is happening, smaller powertrains, smaller engines, that is happening. You mentioned hybrid. Hybrid, our full hybrid technology, and electric mobility, part of the future, is a technological development that we feel is important. We need to optimize existing technologies, but we need to prepare for the future as well. Speaking towards policymakers, the encouragement from governments, from public policy, from city authorities towards the encouragement of electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, the technologies of the future with far, far reduced environmental impact is an important direction, and one that our company is extremely pleased to see happening in many, many of the countries represented here today. We would encourage that direction. On the social side, the downsizing, the deployment of new technology does not have to imply reduced levels of employment. And we are taking steps to protect the skills, the capability, the culture within our company, both on the manufacturing and on the commercial side, for the future. Sustainability for us includes sustainability of our labor, and from that point of view, we want to protect it. So we feel there's not inconsistency, provided the focus is on the future, reducing carbon intensity of technology, at the same time ensuring that we retain and have available the skills when the upturn comes.
Peter Bakker, we've heard several times the injunction that the challenge needs to also be seen as an opportunity. But in fact, listening to some of the workshops yesterday, I got the sense that there is a rethink going on, and that reconfiguration perhaps is happening in a larger sense, that there possibly is a new receptiveness to perhaps systemic thinking, to a willingness to cooperate and change in a way that possibly wouldn't have been possible before the crisis. Do you think that's right?
Well, I would certainly applaud it. I wasn't there yesterday, so I can't comment, but I was listening this morning to the first panel, and then I still heard the quote a number of times of when is the economy going to recover, when are things coming back to normal. And I'm of the opinion it's not going to come back to normal. We're going to have to move to a new normal. If I look at the world, there's at least 4 crises going on, and a lot of our effort here is being spent on talking about the financial and the economic crisis. And it's true, it's a deep one. It's impacting our industry, it's forcing us to lay off people, and it's putting a lot of pressure on our customers. But at the same time, there is an energy crisis, which has driven fuel and oil prices to unprecedented levels and very wobbly price levels, which makes business pretty hard to manage. There's a climate crisis, which cannot be denied anymore, which fortunately more and more people now stop fighting and embrace and try to find solutions. And then somewhat less related, but to the point that the commissioner made, there's a massive food crisis. There's 1 billion people going to bed hungry every year, every day, and that's 100 million more than a year ago. So there are such massive questions that face us as human beings on this planet that if we do not change the system, if we do not change everything, then we're not going to make it. And I think for transport people, that's going to mean a number of things. The operations need to be made more efficient. We need to innovate. We need to bring in new technology. Electric vehicles should be a big part of what we're doing. All inner city delivery, from our point of view, within the next 5 years should go 100% electric. We should look for biofuel solutions for the long haul. We should talk to our customers to completely redesign supply chains. And I'll stop with one example which always sticks well in people's minds. And we should completely rethink business models. We know altogether that the world will continue to urbanize. More and more people will go into bigger and bigger cities. Congestion, air quality is a problem today. That will only get worse. What are we doing to create the sustainable city of the future? And what transport model fits that new city? Is it the same model we use today, that everybody runs into cities with half-empty trucks, or should we come to new solutions? I promise to end with one example, and I'll give it. I run a company which is called TNT, a large global transport company. We have 50 aircraft and we have 30,000 trucks and vans and stuff to deliver your packages. 2 Boeing 747s, and they're gorgeous machines, by the way, particularly in this beautiful orange colors of ours, but 2 Boeing 747s do 9 rotations a week from Europe to China. They leave Europe empty, half full, but we call that empty. They come back totally filled with iPods and all the important things that people buy and are being manufactured in China. 2 Boeing 747s doing 9 rotations a week produce more CO2 than all 30,000 trucks running the streets of Europe in that same week. Well, if that doesn't tell you that global supply chains need to change and that we need to rethink this, then nothing will.
Geoff Hoon, many of the crises that Peter Bakker just mentioned, of course, feed into each other. How do you see it in your discussions with industry and with your colleagues? Is there an increased willingness to think about really innovative systemic solutions?
I hope there is, because there absolutely needs to be. And one of my concerns, actually, trying to link the discussions we had in the first session on the impact of the downturn, is that I would think virtually all of the businesses represented in this audience will not thank me for saying not only is there a massive challenge in relation to dealing with the economic crisis, at the same time there's a massive challenge in dealing with carbon. And we can't afford to put one off at the expense of the other. And that may not be welcome news, because many of those businesses might anticipate higher taxes, they might anticipate the costs of investment, the kinds of things that we were discussing earlier. Nevertheless, we cannot use the downturn as some sort of an excuse for avoiding the adjustment that has just been described to an economy that will have to have a fundamentally different basis. That is the challenge of climate change. And it follows from that policymakers have to be engaged at both levels. We heard a very impressive account of the response in the United States, similarly in other countries, to the impact of the downturn economically. But at the same time, what I'm concerned about, as far as all of those in this room, all of us, I hope, passionate about transport, about moving people and goods around, is that we don't abandon our responsibility for determining the kinds of policies that will be necessary in transport to deal with carbon. It's my slight anxiety, and many people in this room who've been engaged in this subject far longer than I have, but my slight anxiety in many governments is that actually a different part of government is responsible for setting the standards than transport. And what I think we should be doing, transport ministers, policymakers, those in the industry, is to say, actually, we have a responsibility, not least because without that responsibility being exercised, the risk is that other parts of government, other policymakers, under pressure from NGOs and a variety of green organizations, will set standards that transport cannot satisfy. And that is a serious problem for all of us who want to see people and goods go on moving around the planet. The risk, if we don't set our own standards, is that actually the standards that are set for us, sometimes by other parts of our own governments, may be impossible for us to meet. And therefore, what I want to see moving towards Copenhagen, transport ministers really taking an initiative to say, we want to see aviation, we want to see shipping as sectors in their own right as part of those negotiations. That can be done with a single sentence in the communique that comes out of Copenhagen. We then, as transport policymakers, deliver on that principle. But I think otherwise there's a risk that we end up with standards that we cannot satisfy. And it's vitally important that we all get engaged in that debate.
Stelios, yesterday during the workshop concerning environmental aspects in general, there was a great deal of discussion among aviation companies that seemed very much to be taking the kind of initiative that Minister Hoon just mentioned, and saying we must proceed, possibly even on our own if the ICAO is not going to be quick enough to go along, with a global system. Is that something that EasyJet can live with?
I think it's important to start from a premise that travel is good, in the sense that it promotes peace, it promotes understanding between nations, it averts wars, and therefore it should not be stopped. If we believe travel is good, then we should not try and tax it like tobacco. That's the risk here. We're all transport people in this room. And if we allow the policymaker to view transport and travel like tobacco, then I think the world would be a poorer place. Now, assuming travel is good, the question is, how do you make it more environmentally friendly? And EasyJet is it's a company I started 14 years ago. Now it's now one of the biggest airlines in Europe. We carry 45 million passengers a year, one of the most modern fleets in the world. Now, very simply put, the best way to understand environmental friendliness in transport is to think whether it's cheap or not. I'm using a vulgar word here, but the cheaper it is usually, the more environmentally friendly it is. It's engines that pollute, it's not passengers. And the older the engine, the more it pollutes. The more full the plane, the less it pollutes per passenger. I flew here from Luton, from London, on an EasyJet flight that was absolutely packed. And next time you're sitting on one of these planes and it's a little squashed, remember you're doing it to save the planet. It's the most environmentally friendly way of flying. So we have to find a system, and emissions trading might be the system, but there are a lot of variations on the theme, and I wouldn't attempt to even understand them at this stage. But at the same time, there is what we call airport taxes, vaguely. Air passenger duty in British terms, but every government has a tax on a passenger. I think we should think of the whole system and tax the engine, if you like, not the passenger. And emissions trading has the capability of being fairer. The system at the moment is unfair. There are two types of airlines, briefly. The low-cost point-to-point and the long-haul ones that do hub and spoke. We need both. There are two different business models serving two different needs. So I hope the system is fair, it's introduced quickly, it encourages investment. I don't know if Boeing and Airbus are in the room, but the next generation of aircraft will be crucial. My guess, and I'm not an aircraft engineer, but my guess is we're better off going for slower aircraft because it's actually more environmentally friendly. I don't want to offend anybody. I think the designers of Concorde are no longer around. That was a white elephant.
I think Moritz Leuenberger would like to add something.
Okay. I generated a debate. Good.
Ja, ich erlaube mir, Ihnen auf Deutsch zu antworten.
Allow me to answer in German. I don't know. Oh, well, actually, I know this line of argumentation. I mean, people are very, very much against levying taxes, and I'm very familiar with this debate. In Switzerland, we have a toll for trucks, which we introduced at the end of a lengthy political battle. Back then, we were also struggling with the European Union. And the rationale for this was because we need to build infrastructure. We need this infrastructure. This is what railways want. This is what the automotive industry wants. And this is what the airlines want. They want infrastructure. Now, how are we supposed to build infrastructure unless by using money? And where do we get the money from? Well, we don't just take the money from all taxpayers. Well, we take it on the basis of the principle of the polluter pays. We take it on the basis of the user pays principle. And I don't understand an environment where people say, well, mobility is a good thing, mobility is in favor of peace, and we need to promote mobility, but we're not supposed to manage or steer mobility, and how we're supposed to pay for this infrastructure. And let me just reiterate it. When we levy a toll, for instance, from trucks, then this toll is levied in order to invest into a more green or in a cleaner policy. Luckily enough, in the past, we've been able to shift freight from roads to the rails, but we needed money for this. And at the end of the day, also the truck industry benefited from this because sooner or later they did their homework. In the old days, lots of empty trucks had to climb the Alpine region, and luckily now empty. They traveled through the mountainous regions empty, and now, however, they did the arithmetics, and people actually just have full-up trucks traveling the roads. And the same applies to the aviation industry. They want our infrastructure, they want safety, they want Sky Guide, they want an open European sky. Who's supposed to pay for this? Who's supposed to pay for air control infrastructure? Well, of course, we can't use everybody's taxpayers' money for this, but we will just charge those people who use it. And we can't just talk about CO2 reduction and, on the other hand, say, well, but we don't want to charge anything for this. How are we supposed to do this? Politically, how can we create incentives for the automotive industry, for the aviation industry, so as to lower CO2 reductions, unless we charge certain tolls, which we, in our turn, use for CO2 reduction. So this is a very convincing argument. But on the other hand, your government said they decided this month not to go ahead with plans for increasing the petrol or the gasoline tax. That's not right. Sorry, with all due respect, we just adopted an act in Parliament where a CO2 tax was also levied for automobiles. Unfortunately, maybe this was a miscommunication. Up until now, in the mobility sector, we have tried to reduce CO2 emissions, and in the Act we have set ourselves a specific target. Unfortunately, we have not been able to deliver on this. Quite on the contrary, in the mobility sector, CO2 emissions have increased considerably. And now we're 6 months away from Copenhagen, and the European Union wants to reduce the CO2 emission levels by 20 or 25%, and we want to embrace this goal. So we're very much on board with this objective, and we need to make sure that the mobility sector, which is after all, we're aware that it's the quote-unquote dirtiest sector, it's the biggest pollutant, it's the biggest cause of CO2, and we need to charge a levy. Here we have not really fixed.
I know you also have a very interesting proposal for a levy in conjunction with a Copenhagen global emissions system. I'd like to talk about that, though, in just a moment. And first, ask Christian Felber. You've written a book called 50 Proposals for a Fairer World. Would one of those proposals include possibly asking low-fare passengers to pay more, or do you agree with Stelios that more travel is good?
Up to what extent? Up to the more the better, and if I fly every day, it's the best. Do you know that at the moment, only between 1% and 3% of mankind is flying? If everyone flew, traveling by plane would be much worse than tobacco, because it would accelerate climate change by 4 or 5 times. I think this is the core of the problem, which has not been laid on the table so far. Mr. Bakker has touched the core of the problem. Thank you for that. What is the core of the problem? The core of the problem is the global overconsumption of natural resources and the unjust distribution. Mankind is at the moment overconsuming the natural resources of the planet Earth by already 30%. So we are using already more than the Earth can renew per year. And this is not just distributed. Only a small elite is consuming the biggest part. The elite are the 15% of people living in industrialized countries. Just let me give you these very important and illuminating figures. The 15% of people living in industrialized countries in the OECD consume 30% of the global cereals and corn, 30% of the global fish harvest, 40% of the global meat production and milk products, 42% of the global iron and steel, 50% of the global crude oil production, 51% of aluminium, going up to 2/3 with certain mineral resources. And this is the state of the art before the crisis. This is the normal you criticized, and the normal is the crisis. Not the crisis is the crisis. The crisis is a symptom of the normal, which is the deeper crisis. So if we now want to solve the crisis with more trade and more transport, because transport is the means for global trade, we will of course have more consumption of global resources, which is the exactly wrong way. So in my vision, we should not discuss about how could we lower transport costs, but how could we increase transport costs, and not how could we give legal priority to the global market and discriminate local markets. My vision and my perspective, and I know this is the perspective of 90% of people who are living in not industrialized countries, how could we give legal priority to local and regional and sustainable markets and economies? And this would be a shift by 180 degrees, not towards protectionism. It's just priority to sustainable local economic circles. It's food sovereignty, it's economic subsidiarity, and it's fair trade. Fair trade means that we first establish human rights, labor, social, environmental, health, and tax standards, and then make trade. And the effect then is fair trade. And one of the most important preconditions for free trade should be prices, transport prices, in which are integrated all the social and ecological damages transport causes. And this would climb up the prices 5-fold or 10-fold. And then we would not have the end of global trade, but we would have the end of global stupid trade. And we have the priority for food and energy on the local scale.
I want to give Stelios now a chance to respond to that because I see he's eager to do so, but perhaps just add this in, Stelios. That, of course, would mean that a lot of your passengers would stop flying to destinations like the Maldives or wherever else.
We don't fly there, but...
Okay, what would that mean for jobs in those places? Do we not also need to consider the job-generating effects of travel itself?
Let me start by saying that I agree we have to do something about climate change. That's not what I'm arguing about. I believe it's unfair, it would be socially unjust to use taxation, to use price, as a way of excluding the poor from traveling, from flying. It's socially unjust. That's my problem with it. I think, go back to the fundamental principle, it's the bloody engine that pollutes, it's not the passenger. So let's focus on what's causing the pollution, and that's essentially the machine, whether it's the aircraft, its engines, or any other mode of transport, the equivalent vessel. But let's create and design taxation, create and design an emissions trading scheme that focuses on the machine and forces people to actually replace machines efficiently and be more efficient also by design. Boeing and Airbus are going to design the next generation of aircraft in the next 5 to 10 years. Depends on economics, depends on the oil price as well. If the oil price goes up, it's more profitable to design more efficient aircraft. So we have to make sure whatever policy we put in place now, it encourages the next generation of aircraft to be 50% more efficient. We can do it. It's just a question of putting the right incentives in place to encourage people to be 50% more efficient for the same number of passengers carried.
Just two sentences. The price is already today discriminating and regulating the access to flying because 97% of mankind do not fly, have never entered an airplane. So the only alternative to price regulation is that you make contingents to every human being on this earth. You may flow once a year or once every 2 years, just to keep logical.
George Dragnich, I'd like to bring you in and ask you, for this 98%, are there benefits in employment, in income for them from the fact that the other 2% are traveling, or is that simply a Band-Aid that we put on the inequalities?
I think you can really address this from the focus of global trade and global transportation, which I think is really the focus of this larger meeting, and not on one particular sector in terms of air transportation. Certainly in this case, and you ask about the Maldives and the developing country, much of the tourism and the ILO, the International Labor Organization, has done a tremendous amount of work on tourism, because tourism is a labor-intensive industry, and in the developing world, it often is the largest single employer. Those of you in this room have come to Leipzig, a lovely town, and we've been waited on very nicely in our hotels, and we don't want to be waited on by an automaton. Where we go on holiday in the developing world, we love to be waited on. And it is and always will be a human-intensive industry. It's a major earner of employment. What the ILO is and has always been is a forum for tripartite discussion and policy making between governments, employers, and those employed, i.e. the workers, is to ensure that it's fair. I certainly agree about the comments that have been made on this panel and earlier this morning about the crisis before the crisis, a point that the ILO had in a commission that we convened in 2002 and finally concluded in a declaration on social justice for fair globalization last year. This is the point that it should be equitable. And we would argue that by bringing in all of the players, which would include those people who are employed, the people who, with their employers, create the real economy, and if the governments listen to them, that we'll have the best policies and the most employment and the best trained and the best skilled. Thank you.
Geoff, Hoon, you wanted to add?
Well, I think we ought to be grateful, actually, to Attac, because we've just heard a perfect summary of what I'm against, if you'll forgive me for saying so, because what NGOs of this kind want to do is they want to ration travel by price. And it's ironic that, frankly, you talked about the elite travelling, but think back to aviation. Before the 1970s, before Sir Freddie Laker, only the wealthy could travel the Atlantic. Before EasyJet came along, we didn't have, as we have in the United Kingdom, large numbers of people being able to travel regularly for a fraction of the previous price. So actually, low-cost airlines have democratized travel. They've made it available to everyone. And that surely is the ambition of policymakers. So we don't want to be in a situation where we're trying to rein back that ability of people to travel in order that we satisfy targets on carbon. Because we can satisfy those targets in other ways, by technology, by using new materials for engines, new materials for the manufacture of aircraft, as Ray LaHood was saying, more effective ways of moving aircraft around the world. We can achieve those targets by using the technology, but we don't want to do that at the expense of allowing people to travel. Because it's not only that the West will suffer. Every day now, scores of aircraft fly from Africa, carrying fresh produce to Western Europe. Now, what that is doing is providing enormous numbers of jobs, development, opportunities for some of the very poorest people in the world. Without those flights arriving every day to satisfy demands from, I accept, relatively wealthy Western consumers, those people would not have work. That is opening up the world. So there's another sense in which globalization is benefiting the poorest people. It's giving those people opportunities of work that, frankly, were unrecognizable prior to the way in which we've seen an expansion of aviation and indeed an expansion of shipping. We can't turn that clock back, but I accept that we have to make sure that we get proper standards in place from a perspective of transport that deliver the targets on carbon.
I'd like to give Peter Bakker a chance to reply, and then briefly, Mr. Felber.
I'm not sure we should continue this debate too long. I think in general, any policy that starts with people need to do something less than they do today is going to be very unpopular and hard to get through any democracy. So even though I'm sympathetic to some of the things you said, I don't think that's the answer. The real pressure that's on all of us is not how do we continue to want more of what we have been doing, but how are we going to do it better. So the real stress test for me for Copenhagen will be, can we come up with a price for carbon and an accounting system behind the price for carbon that is going to incentivize the leaders in the business community to really clean up their act. And that's like Stelios said. You should have cleaner engines and you should differentiate yourself as an airline by having the cleanest engines. I want to be the first transport company which is 100% electric in its inner city delivery. Give me the incentives to do that and I'll create jobs, I'll create innovation as a result of it. But make what we do better and only focusing on doing less, even though it's going to achieve something, is not going to be very popular.
Let me briefly, before you speak, Christian Felber, perhaps now bring in Minister Leuenberger on this. The question perhaps is not telling people they should do less of this thing, but telling people you should be aware of and internalize the costs of what you do. That, of course, is what Copenhagen is about. The Swiss have made a proposal for Copenhagen that a levy should be put on carbon dioxide emissions charges, which would go into a fund, and this fund would then be used to help developing countries adapt and mitigate, if I understand correctly. Would you tell us a little bit more about your proposal? And then I would like to come back to Christian Felber and ask him whether he can live with a proposal like that.
Is a proposal from a climate vantage point, policy vantage point, and our model is that within our country we need that, because if the polluter pays principle is used, if we say CO2 emissions create damages, and these damages need to be avoided or they need to be compensated for, so in other words, build dams against flooding or relocate people, the Maldives, for example, they are very subject to climate change, and it will have an impact on those countries that are not producing CO2 emissions, and they are suffering the most from climate change. So how can the international community prevent and pay for the damage that's created? And that's the same principle. Those who generate emissions, they should pay for it. And it's at the same time an incentive to reduce CO2 emissions. So we're doing this on our small scale. And I gave you the example of trucks and rail transport. And with the revenue from taxes, we are now able to pay for digging the tunnel through the Alps. And the same model is now being used. CO2 tax paid by those countries that generate a lot of emissions, the damage can be compensated for where the impact happens. So this is somewhat simplified. Of course, the system is much more complex. But let me link up to the discussion before this. No one is saying that mobility will grow and grow and grow. Nobody is saying that this will not happen. And the purpose in life is also to move. People want to move about, and no way will governments be able to say, we will stop you from moving. We can't ration flying. We can't ration driving, moving, traveling. People's wish to be mobile is much too great. But it is the responsibility of governments to structure that. And that is why, what was said before, we need to support, for example, hybrid motors, electrical engines. We can set standards. We can make for rules. But the power game is very different. Mobility is determined by the automotive industry, which is a global industry and which has a lot of political clout and can put pressure on national governments. And so even a single government can't really make the rules. So it is the international community for climate change has already been able to make sure that we almost have a breakthrough for the electrical engine. And the next step then is for politicians to make sure that energy that's generated for the electrical engine needs to be generated in a different way. We know we will have a scarcity of electricity, but nobody has calculated what will it mean that if 90%, even 100% of all engines will be run electrically, how will we generate that electricity? Again, it's our job as politicians to guide this, and we will need the finances for that.
Ever. I want to contradict totally. In 1 minute I will support your proposal, but in this theoretical approach that mobility is increasing, I contradict radically, because I think that mobility is shrinking. The effort with which we are thinking us ourselves mobiles is rising ever, with cars and financial turnovers and road infrastructures. But what is mobility? Mobility is, in an alternative definition, the ability to access my daily goals in the most efficient and easy way possible, if possible by foot. We don't have more goals than we had 500 years ago, but we need more energy and more cars and more infrastructure and even airplanes to get to our places. And this is the unsustainable, most unsustainable way of mobility we have coming to regard normal. Your proposal I can underwrite perfectly, because it has been the global north which has overconsumed over the past centuries, which has consumed 80%, now 50% of global resources, and we have to pay back this ecological debt to the south. So I agree and I support, and I would even put more radical. We are now discussing where should we pay the tax. Should we pay the tax per plane? Should we tax the end users? But why tax the carbon dioxide at the exit of the economy? Why shouldn't we much more efficiently tax the carbon in the entrance of the economy? because these are much fewer places where carbon is entering the economic process, and there we could not only easier put the tax, but we could also regulate the quantity, because the problem is that too much carbon is entering the economy, and if we really want to stop climate change, I think we should have to absolutely reduce the entrance of carbon into the economy. This would require a global agreement, but this is nothing different from the Climate Convention and the Kyoto Protocol. These are global agreements. And I think this would be the more efficient way, because I agree also with you that the emission trading is the least efficient and most complicated system of trying to reduce the carbon dioxide emissions.
Graham Smith, when we're looking at the impulse for changing behavior, making it more sustainable, do you think that it is really purely economic factors that are at work, market signals, or is there perhaps a more deep-seated underlying cultural element? And I'm thinking, for instance, about Switzerland and its truly amazing policy to shift all rail freight, for instance, all freight to rail. Switzerland is a country that's had a long love affair with the train. Switzerland is a country with a tremendous environmental consciousness. Do you think such factors make a difference in trying to promote the sorts of behavioral change we're talking about?
For sure, we absolutely have to bring civic society and consumers with us on this journey. Climate change, mitigating climate change, is not just the responsibility of politicians, nor is it alone the responsibility of large global commercial organizations. Civic society has to join in this journey together. That means civic society as citizens and as consumers. And the choices they make obviously will determine some of the outcomes, for better or for worse, that we are addressing in this discussion. We want those outcomes to be for the better, lower carbon intensity, etc. The technology from global industries like automotive is being brought forward. From our company, hybrids, and others will follow. Electric vehicles are coming. The issue is not the ability to deploy the technology, and regulation and lightened regulation is strongly encouraging that as well. What we now have to do is to move the environment and environmental concerns up the list of priorities of consumers. For automotive, it is well below other factors like the price, the value of the vehicle, the equipment, the performance, the safety, etc. Environment is not number one, number two, number three, number four. It is much lower down. It is rising, but it's much lower down. So therefore, structures, whether they are incentives towards electric vehicles, plug-in hybrid vehicles, announced in some countries already, and I applaud that, or whether it is enlightened fiscal policy that helps that journey, sending economic signals to consumers. These are the steps that will help civic society move in the direction that is necessary and will further encourage organizations in automotive, in the airline industry, in distribution to innovate, to reduce the carbon intensity of their operations. And this we need to do as well. It's bringing the supply side and the demand side together. The supply side is moving faster, is driven by regulation. The demand side needs to accelerate, in our opinion, and that's why we do call for incentives for future green technologies.
What's Leuenberger you wanted to add?
Ich möchte diesen Standpunkt
I'd like to support what was said just now. I'd like to support what was just said. The present financial crisis and environmental crisis are very, very closely connected, very closely linked. In other words, we have lost sense of all measure. That was the case with the financial case, trading in derivatives. It was the case also with the environmental crisis. We are living beyond our means. We are using up too much energy. The planet would have to be available 6 times over if everybody were to have the lifestyle that we have in Europe, in the United States or North America. And so after the Industrial Revolution 120 years ago, we then had, as a response to that, the welfare state, because the Industrial Revolution created a lot of misery. And after World War II, the social market economy was developed. And this is where I fully agree with you, that according to the present crisis now, a sustainable economy is being developed, an ethical way of doing business, so that everyone involved in an endogenous fashion thinks about the ethical implications. But how can we make captains of industry and everyone else make sure that they stick to the political rules and that they stick to the ethical principles? You can't simply preach to them. You need technical rules, you need also financial incentives, and that's why we also need taxation in order to bring about this ethical behavior.
Because that, of course, is very much part of the social culture of Europe when we're talking about broader factors. We've given, unfortunately, rather short shrift to social issues here, but I would like to come back to you now, George Dragnich, and ask you, we heard a plea from Christian Felber earlier in the discussion for higher social standards, also for jobs in emerging economies and the developing countries. There is, of course, a strong awareness that social costs also need to be internalized, but what would that really mean in practice for the 200 million people who are employed in precarious jobs in developing countries? Would they not then simply be unemployed?
Certainly, were you not to have a global trade, you would have a dramatic drop in employment, and you would have had a substantially smaller growth in global employment. People often talk about a figure in China of 200 million people having been pulled out of poverty, and this was not just the genius of the regime, but in fact it was global trade that's done this. So the International Labor Organization would never ever say that we are in any way not supportive of global trade. At the start of the World Trade Organization, there was some give and take between the two organizations, with the WTO saying that international labor standards were the purview of the ILO, which was a nice way of saying, keep them there. Don't let them infiltrate the WTO. We have, in intervening years, developed a close working relationship with the WTO, which, by the way, is in our old building in Geneva. You have all these wonderful Diego Rivera type murals of workers striving in the 1920s as only a muralist could do in that era in the WTO. So I'm always pleased that my colleagues at the WTO are reminded of this every time they go to work. But what we have today with the WTO is an understanding that international labor standards will not be used as a means to get an unfair trade advantage by chasing lower employment. And we heard people this morning say that wage costs actually were not the factor in a global economy looking ahead that they have been in the past. At the same time, the WTO has expected of us, and we have certainly supported the notion that labor standards will not be used as an artificial trade barrier, as a barrier to trade. So the dialogue is a good deal more mature than say it was 10 or 15 years ago. What we have insisted upon and continue to do so as the UN organization responsible for the labor market and the world of work is that it be a dialogue among all those that take part in it and direct it, which is the governments and the employers and the workers. And when you do that, each country will, according to its own laws, if they're enforced as well as they are enacted, and most are enacted fairly, that you will have a rising tide.
I think that the fear that dumping will take place if you have these standards or unfair trade advantages, this is state of the art now, because now we don't have these standards, and now any country can lower its standards and make an unfair advantage against others. And this is why the subcommission of the United Nations for the Human Rights in 2003 wrote a nice catalogue of 18 norms on the behavior of transnational corporations that they have obligatorily fulfill human rights standards, your labor standards, social standards, health standards, environmental standards. But these standards have not been implemented by the governments because the resistance, not from the poor countries, they didn't make the resistance. The resistance came from the International Chamber of Commerce, from the International Employers Organization. They said, we don't need these standards because we want to behave voluntarily well. So please, governments, don't implement these standards. That's the state of the art. China last year finally made a minimum salary last year in 2008, and who did oppose it? Who did oppose it? The European Chamber of Commerce and the American Chamber of Commerce, because our corporations cannot produce so cheap anymore in China, and some of them went to Vietnam because Vietnam does not have a minimum salary. So I think it's not the poor countries who oppose, or even less the working people in the poor countries who oppose global binding standards for the corporations. It's our corporations who want to make more profits.
Sorry, briefly.
I'll let the minister respond.
Well, go ahead, briefly, because I'm going to ask him to give us his last word.
I have to take issue with that because, in fact, in the intervening decade, corporate social responsibility (CSR) has become a norm in global corporations. We're here on the transport side, I'm sure, but if I could just very briefly mention a program that we had. The Better Work program that started in Cambodia 10 years ago, will mark its anniversary this fall, which is extended to Vietnam. We'll be going into, we're in Haiti now, we'll probably be going to Peru, we're in Jordan, Morocco. And this is a program that works in concert with the multinational global buyers, the GAPs, the Levi's of the world. And it's relevant for you in the transport sector because you transport these clothes and garments. This is primarily in the textile and the garment industry. You transport these fashion items back to this market. You provide the sinews of global trade that provide this and generate this employment. What we've seen in the downturn, and that's why we're here, is in this context, is that the international, the multinational firms have to maintain this standard. As a senior executive of Levi's mentioned to me in San Francisco, we don't sell blue jeans, we sell a brand created over 200 years. They cannot afford to lower standards. Levi's is actually giving us a very generous grant, the Levi's Foundation for the Better Work program. I'm not at liberty to say what that is because we haven't signed it yet. We don't have, the check's in the mail. I'll wait till it gets to Geneva. And it's because they can't. And these buyers are saying to us, and I'm talking about whether it's Tesco in groceries, which air freights grapes from South Africa and puts the carbon price on the package, or if it's textiles, they will maintain this standard. They don't have this choice. I once had the CEO of Toys R Us say to me, can you imagine the image that it would be if a muckraking journalist were to find to take a photograph of a child in China producing toys for children in the United States? He was explaining to me why Toys R Us was such a leader in the fight to eradicate the worst forms of child labor. So these corporations do that. But then what you find in so many cases is their competitors, who are actually the local companies who are not in the international buying chain, are the unscrupulous ones. The people at the end of the day who are getting truly disadvantaged are their workers.
The draft norms of the United States said that the law is also valid for the suppliers. So the brand corporations cannot say it's not my guilt because it was the supplier, because they are responsible, because they have the power, they have the purchasing power, that all the suppliers have to fulfill the same standards. And then they are not in a competition anymore because everyone is obliged to fulfill the same standards. This is the proposal of the United Nations, which has not been implemented. And the examples you reported, like Levi's or Tesco, these are the exceptions from the rule. The rule is that no one is obliged by law to behave fine. And as long as no one is obliged by law to behave fine, we will have some of the exceptions, but many of the textile industry companies do still employ women who work 60 hours a week without can go to the toilet to make glue, even without permission. Human rights standards are violated dramatically, and no one is allowed to check it. The photo of the child cannot be made.
I'm going to have to cut the discussion off right here and ask you to continue it at lunch. I'm sorry, because we are well over our time, but I would like to give the last word to Geoff Hoon and ask you, perhaps looking toward Copenhagen in just a little more than 6 months from now, what are the messages you take away today, and how optimistic are you that we can get to the kind of systemic solutions we talked about at the outset for both social and environmental issues?
Well, turning the subject, in a sense, back to transport, but following on from that interesting discussion, no one can argue against having a floor of rights for working people, and I think the work the ILO does has been commendable in that area. But what has transformed the Chinese economy? What has transformed the economy of India and a number of other previously very poor countries? It's transport. I first went to China in 1985 when the communist leadership had just changed the rule that allowed farmers to sell their surplus production. So on the streets of Beijing were barrows with foodstuffs which people were buying. Now, that's a little over 20 years ago. And to go to Beijing today, the city is unrecognizable. Transport has made those changes because it's allowed farmers, entrepreneurs, businesses in China to develop, to expand, to sell around the world. So China is no longer a country, as it was in the mid-1980s, that was struggling to feed its population. It is an increasingly wealthy nation, as is India. We've mentioned a number of other examples. Vietnam, a number of countries of Africa are developing as a result of access to the global market that transport provides. But that comes at a price. So to answer your question, that price is carbon. We have got to find a way of setting the right standards that allow that global trade in goods, but equally that allow Stelios and others to operate businesses that encourage a global movement of people. Travel, in that sense, is liberating. It has all sorts of consequences for our understanding of the rest of the world that I hope in the long term will have real benefits to our ability to live together in peace and harmony around the world. In that sense, therefore, we do have this obligation moving towards Copenhagen for the people in this room to establish standards, to find solutions. Because, to repeat the point I made earlier, I'm really quite seriously concerned that otherwise we end up with a set of standards, a set of obligations that transport simply cannot satisfy, and we end up pricing transport out of the reach of the ordinary people that I represent. And I think that's a fundamental challenge for those of us who are passionate about transport.
Passionate about transport is a very good last phrase for that discussion. Thank you very much. Professor Venables will now summarize for us all of what we've heard this morning in as little time as possible so that everyone can go to lunch.
Yeah, I'm well aware that I'm sitting between you and lunch, so I'll endeavour to be as superficial as I possibly can, and certainly not summarise everything. But there are 3 points I want to make, and they're really about the challenges facing the sector as it comes out of recession, out of a crisis. We obviously have the overarching objective of continuing to really reap benefits of globalization, but at the same time, the climate change imperative. So they're the overarching objectives. Anyway, 3 points I want to make. First, competition. Now, we heard in the first section this morning about financial pressure on firms. Clearly, it's you operate in a very, very cyclical sector. Firms are going bust, and this industry is likely to come out of the recession more concentrated with fewer players than it went in. That would be a bad thing, or rather, I would press for vigorous antitrust policy investigation in the period after the recession to make sure that competition levels are restored. I think there's an analogy here. I mean, governments have obviously built up big deficits in fighting the recession, and those will need to be unwound. And similarly, in the transport sector, there will be an increase in competition, and I think a case for unwinding that. So that's point one. Point two, globalization, reconfiguring supply chains. Again, something that was talked about a little bit in the first session. Let me make a couple of remarks about that. Let me think about that through a sort of development economics perspective. Now there, it's absolutely clear that globalization, integrating countries in the world market, has been the key to poverty reduction. If you look at the report of the Commission on Growth and Development, and God knows how many academic papers, bringing countries fully integrated in the world economy is the key to poverty reduction. It's worth reflecting for a very short moment on how that works. By specializing in a narrow set of areas, countries can build up their skills, build up their capabilities, employ the labor that would otherwise be unemployed. But then, of course, that's a phase. They build up, and China has built up skills, has built up capabilities, is now in a position to start broadening out its economic base, start turning to the domestic market, putting less weight on export markets. So we are going to see a reconfiguration of supply chains, that pattern of integration of countries in the world economy. The role of China in that will change. But the important point, of course, is that many regions of the world got left out of the pre-crisis wave of globalization. So bringing them into the post-crisis wave of globalization is going to be key. And obviously Africa's first amongst those regions that was left out. I guess my view there is that Africa will actually succeed, or some African countries, I should say, will actually succeed in integrating quite well in the world economy in coming years. Standards of governance in Africa have improved enormously. They're comparable with what they were in Asia, certainly 20 or 30 years ago. But I think a very interesting question for this audience, this group of people, is if these African countries are integrated, they are beginning to become participants in the global economy, then is it going to be through people in this room and through the OECD, or is it going to be a completely eastward-looking set of players playing that role in Africa? So that was point two, the importance of globalization, supply chains, reconfiguration, their importance in development. The final point, point three, is obviously I have to come to climate issues. I think on climate, it's always worth starting off by restating some basic numbers that people don't get, frankly. That is, that if we're going to get to a safe path, 450 parts per million, maybe 2 degrees centigrade warming, if we're going to get to that path, then OECD countries have got to reduce CO2 emissions by 80%. Another way of putting that is that carbon productivity, the CO2 per unit GDP, carbon productivity has got to rise by about 7% a year, every year now until 2050, right? So they're the sorts of numbers that you need to have in the back of your mind before you begin thinking about this. Okay, so thinking about the transport sector, thinking about maritime, thinking about aviation, can technology do it? Well, obviously there will be fantastic technological improvements. That's a key part of the story. 7% a year, no. Simply not going to happen, right? So I think the design of a really rigorous, effective policy framework to address climate change and to apply to transport sectors is absolutely crucial. The policy regime will have to incentivate research and development to try and speed up the technological change, but it will also have to manage demand. It'll have to ration by price, if you want to use that language, but it is going to have to work on the demand side as well as just hoping that the technology will do it. Around here the last couple of days, I've heard lots of very good discussions about market-based trading systems, emissions permit systems that people are thinking about, and are working on. Let me just make two remarks about that. First is there's a real urgency here, and I think there's a danger that the best becomes the enemy of the good here. Yeah, the full global deal is great, but we need leadership. We need to initiate, get schemes in place. And that's fine so long as we don't design schemes that just lock in mistakes. So let's start, my position will be to start somewhere, get things moving, and hopefully the global deal will follow. Second point on that, I think the transport sector has a particular responsibility here because there's a potential pot of money, the auction revenues from international transport that really could be enormously important in bringing developing countries into negotiation. I mean, adaptation funds, what the world, the size of the adaptation funds needed at the moment actually aren't that great, but they will rise to tens of billions of dollars a year over the next couple of decades. So having a tax base in international transport is surely a good tax base to bring developing countries into negotiations is really important. So I think the transport sector has a real responsibility to get these market-based schemes moving.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you to all of our panelists now and our panelists earlier as well. Thank you to our keynote speakers. Thank you very, very much to our audience for your tremendous patience and attention during what was a very intensive session, but I hope an interesting one. Thanks to Jack Short and the ITF for all the work they've done to put together this very, very interesting morning, and to our translators upstairs. You've also had a very hard morning, so much gratitude to you as well. And now, lunch. It's quite late, I'm sorry, but I know the food's still there, don't worry. And may I just ask, all ministers, heads of delegations, everyone who's received an invitation to the minister's lunch, you have, please, just a very brief wait still. If you would go out through this door over here, my left, your right, you will find a little cordoned off area with some refreshments to tide you over, and we will then call you back into the room for a brief photo op. Everybody else, go enjoy your lunch. Thank you very much. I let it go.